The UK's latest budget is frankly disappointing. It may be a slight improvement over what we could have expected from a Conservative government. It does offer increased funding in some areas of public service, but it lacks ambition. It lacks vision. It lacks the transformative power required to address the UK's deeper issues of poverty, inequality and stagnant growth. The budget largely relies on the hope that future economic growth will save the day, yet it provides little to actually fuel that growth. The budget is a cautious adjustment, not the bold transformation needed. It's a bare minimum effort to stabilise the public sector that's been underfunded for years. Now, I definitely welcome the increase in the minimum wage and some of the lifeline funding for the NHS and education, but these are surface level changes. For the NHS, which sees the biggest increase, this budget does little more than just about keep it afloat. As the King's Fund puts it, the health spending announced today is unlikely to be enough for patients to see a real improvement in the care they receive. In reality, these funds just keep existing commitments barely met, while some departments, such as the Home Office, will still face cuts in real terms. The UK needs a much more ambitious approach, one that restores public services, eradicates poverty, and puts the country on a more equitable footing. For this, we need significant investment, and yes, we need to increase taxes on the wealthy to pay for it. Instead, what we get is a budget that tinkers. It adds small improvements, but it does nothing transformative. There are 4 key shortcomings in the budget, the things which make me the most disappointed, and the things which are just plain mistakes, I think. The first relates to public transport costs and environmental contradictions. The government have increased bus fares from £2 to £3, a 50% increase. I'm staggered by this. This is perhaps the single most flawed policy of the whole budget, I think. It has a very significant impact on low-paid workers who rely on buses to commute, especially in rural and suburban areas. Rising fares reduce workers' take-home income. It limits their job opportunities. It makes commuting unaffordable. The lack of support in this area seems totally out of touch with the government's stated aim to support working families. To make things worse, fuel duty remains frozen. What's going on here? This is an environmentally unsound choice that seems counterproductive to the UK's climate goals. While bus fares rise, the lack of action on fuel duty illustrates a puzzling inconsistency in the government's environmental commitments. Why would you hit those on the lowest incomes with a 50% bus fare increase while keeping an incentive to use cars? The second point is the stealth tax on lower income earners. This is actually one of the most insidious aspects of this budget. Continuation of the freezing of income tax thresholds. This is a stealthy and regressive way of increasing taxes on working people, directly the opposite of what Labour says that they want to do. As inflation pushes nominal wages up, more lower and middle income earners are dragged into the tax bands, effectively paying more tax without a real increase in purchasing power. This was a Tory policy, but Labour have continued it, and the impact will be to increase tax paid by some working people. This is going to bring many low-paid workers into the tax net who previously wouldn't have paid any tax, so it will add significant financial strain to the cost of living crisis. The OBR actually does the calculation. Between this year and 2028, 900,000 people, almost 1 million people, will go over the frozen tax threshold and have to start paying tax. I guess that technically Labour would argue that they haven't increased anything. They've just kept the same Tory tax thresholds. But this is dishonest. By not indexing the tax threshold, more people on extremely low incomes will have to pay taxes. Plus, more people will be taken into the higher 40% tax threshold. This absolutely means that taxes of working people will be increased under a Labour government. The third issue is that there are only minimal concrete plans for growth. Reeves has repeatedly promised to get Britain growing, but the budget's growth strategy is vague at best. The Office for Budget Responsibility has estimated minimal growth over the coming years, taking into account this budget. Growth will increase to 2% next year, but then it'll go back down to around 1.5% in the next 3 to 5 years. Average growth in the post-war period was 2.4%. So the forecast growth levels over the next 5 years are well below average. And public sector investment, while it's set to increase briefly, is going to taper off again in future years. And it raises questions about where the sustainable growth is going to come from. The government is betting on there being some magical growth that will somehow arise. Not impossible, but not likely based on current forecasts. The fourth point to emphasise is the minimal ambition that Labour seems to have to address poverty. Despite acknowledging the UK's child poverty problem, the budget does not propose meaningful measures to address this. The increase in spending spread across different sectors fails to directly target poverty alleviation. Reeves has avoided expanding universal credit or introducing new income support for the poorest households, even as poverty levels rise. This piecemeal approach mirrors prior Conservative budgets and skirts the need for comprehensive welfare reform and affordable housing investment. Bear in mind, Labour's already targeted pensioners with the abolition of the winter fuel allowance, and it's refused to lift the two-child benefit cap. There's a lot of evidence that both of these things actually will make poverty worse. Things that Labour could change, but have definitively decided not to. Past Labour governments made considerable progress on poverty by targeting benefits to those in need. That's the tradition of the Labour Party. But here, that legacy is overlooked in favour of a super cautious approach. Minimal change, but still completely accepting the neoliberal economic policies of the previous government. Reeves's choices are a missed opportunity to break the cycle of poverty for millions. This is really sad and, for me, totally unacceptable. Overall, Labour's first budget does mark a modest step forward. It's basically more of the same though, rather than being transformational. The incremental improvements such as small wage increases and minor funding boosts, they're overshadowed by a stealth tax on lower earners, a 50% increase in bus fares, no real plan to deal with poverty, and no comprehensive plan for growth. Addressing inequality and poverty requires bold policies and structural reform. Yet this budget's cautious measures barely scratch the surface. It's better, but nowhere near enough. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.